Get started. This is Russ Holland. I'm a partner in the Center for Technology and Disability, and it is my pleasure today to introduce my friend and colleague, Joy Zabala. Dr. Zabala is the Director of Technical Assistance for CAST and the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials. Many of you will know Joy is a founder of Quiet, Quality Indicators for Assistive Technology, facilitator of the Quiet Listserv, now grown to over 3,500 participants, developer of the SET framework to support appropriate assistive technology and services, and many other efforts, most recently in Australia, to expand the use of accessible materials, technology, and other supports to help the literacy, communication, and participation and productivity of all. She's former president of the Technology and Media Division of the Council for Exceptional Children, and to our benefit serves as a faculty member for the Center on Technology and Disability. Joy, it's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Russ, and it's delightful to be here. Thank you all for having me and for this really, hopefully, interesting and stimulating event this week. Our topic is accessible educational materials in 2015 and the basics for educators and families. And Anna Maria, why don't we look at the first poll to make this as meaningful as possible for participants. There are a couple of things we'd like to ask you. So go ahead and make a selection on from what perspective do you approach accessible educational materials? And Anna Maria, you can draw the poll to a close when you wish. It looks like we've got currently about 50% teachers and related service providers. This is wonderful. We have users of AIM, either current or potential. We have family members, we have educational administrators, and leaders in the selection of educational materials, all of those groups. So that's a good thing. That's pretty much how it should be because there are many perspectives that have to come together around this work. So let's look at the second polling question while we're starting. What is your current understanding of or involvement with accessible educational materials? Are you new to AIM or know about AIM but still have lots of questions, or are comfortable with using this in your own work or using it to lead others in their selection? It looks like we have some people who are new to AIM, which is great because we will hopefully help you become a part of that middle group, which I think is probably really where most of us are, is knowing about AIM but still having lots of questions. Even people like me who deal with AIM every single day actually also have a good many questions from time to time. There's a great deal about which we need to think as we go forward. So hopefully in this time period, you'll have an opportunity to not only hear me talk about AIM, but you also have the opportunity to put questions in the chat box, comments in the chat box, and Anna Maria and Russ will monitor that chat box and bring those questions in. And it's fine with me if the questions come in at the time that they're asking, that you're thinking about them. Don't necessarily wait. But what may happen with some of your questions is if I know we're coming to something about them shortly, I may ask you if it's okay to wait just a bit with answering that particular question or addressing it. So let's get started. The purpose and big ideas are really to look a little bit at the legal and pedagogical rationales for providing accessible educational materials, the changing language of accessible educational materials, some sources of AIM and who can use each source, and then supportive tools and resources, which we'll touch on just a little bit and explore much more as we go through the conversation in the cafe during the week. So the goal, I wanted to introduce you a little bit in what's happened at the formerly AIM Center, Accessible Instructional Materials, to the new AEM Center, Accessible Educational Materials. The goal of both the AIM Center and we also pronounce AEM AIM is to build the capacity of states and districts and post-secondary institutions, families, publishers, and other stakeholders to increase the availability and use of high-quality AIM that support improved learning opportunities for students in K-12, in higher education, and in the workplace. Also with looking at early learning and that introduction and foundational steps that are related to early learning and the use of educational materials that are accessible and usable by the individual. So a key, you'll notice that availability and use are underlined. The real focus of this particular center is no longer just the creation of these kinds of materials, but actually not only availability, but actually focusing on the use of these materials to support learning. So what do the IDEA regulations say about accessible materials? You'll find that information in Section 300-172 of the final regulations, and basically what they say, and this is of course paraphrased, is that there are provisions that require state and local education agencies to ensure that textbooks and related core materials are provided to students with print disabilities in specialized formats in a timely manner. Now, while that is a fairly concise statement, there are lots of things within that statement that actually are a bit confusing. People are pretty sure they know what textbooks are, but related core instructional materials are those things that are packaged with the textbook. When you order that textbook, you're also ordering perhaps a workbook or supplementary readers or those kinds of things. Those are related core instructional materials. It doesn't have anything to do with core courses or the Common Core particularly. It's whatever's being brought into the learning environment in print needs to be made available to students who cannot use that print effectively because of a disability in that specialized format. One of the things that's often misunderstood is that the legal requirement to provide these materials is placed on state and local education agencies. Publishers do not have to provide these kinds of materials unless state and local education agencies who are purchasing these materials require that in their purchasing contracts. The Office of Special Education Programs and the IDEA cannot place requirements on publishers. However, as part of a purchasing contract, you as a purchaser, you meaning the state or local education agency, include in your contract that a file must be made from which specialized formats can be created. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those are in just a moment. There's a term, print disability. You may have noticed in that last slide, students with print disabilities. Interestingly, print disability is a term that appears in IDEA, but is not specifically defined. It does not appear in copyright law. It came from the grassroots and then was included in IDEA. In general usage, it refers to being unable to read or use standard print materials because of blindness or another disability. So the key thing to think about is a print disability is not one of the disabilities which can be used as a qualifier for services under IDEA. So a print disability is a functional disability that could be as a result of quite a wide variety of actual disability categories, if you would. So when we think about the functional definition of accessibility, basically this graphic is to talk a little bit about that, to provide students with disabilities the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as students without disabilities with substantially equivalent ease of use. And that substantially equivalent ease of use is really an important part of all that. This is a very small part of a joint letter that came from the Department of Justice and the Department of Education, which really focused on accessibility not only in educational materials, but in communication in many other ways, sort of ups the ante from just being something that's required under IDEA, but the Department of Justice is looking at it as a civil right. So we have to be thinking about both of those things. So what are accessible educational materials? And I'm going to frame this a little bit in keeping the language current to give you a little bit about when we looked at that the wording from the statute. Remember that in 2004, there was still, even though there was a toe in the water of digital materials. Most materials at that time were still in a print format that were hard copy and could not be changed very much without retrofitting. So in 2015, we see a very different environment. So let's go back a little bit and look at how language can be a barrier and language can be a capacity builder. If we keep our language up to date and we have a common vocabulary, then we're less likely to act from common misunderstandings, and we'll understand that things change over time. So some of you may have heard the term NIMUS, and when we thought about AIM as NIMUS, what exactly did that mean? NIMUS is a way, it's a standard, the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard, to which publishers can create and tag an XML source file that can be transformed into student-ready specialized formats. And what that means is that this file is not a file that you send to a student or you give to a student. This file is a file that can be changed into the specialized formats that we're going to talk about in just a moment. There is also another thing you might have heard, and that is where publishers place those NIMUS compliant files, and that is the NIMAC, the National Instructional Materials Access Center. So just to be aware that those are there, and let's look at how thinking about AIM as NIMUS, where that's a facilitator and where that's a barrier. If you are a purchaser of materials or a publisher of materials, or if you are an accessible media producer, it's important for you to know about the NIMUS file. But NIMUS, and thinking about AIM as NIMUS, is a barrier for those of us who are decision makers for individual students, for educators and families, because there's this sense that that's the way that the need for accessible materials can be met, and if you don't meet the eligibility standards, that maybe we don't use those things. So the common misunderstandings relate to eligibility, and also something that I've already mentioned, and that is the fact that it is not, the NIMUS file is not a student-ready version. It is a source file, and then also that it's all that's needed in order to address the needs of students with print disabilities. Then we move to AIM as specialized formats. In those regulations that I paraphrased a little bit earlier, in Section 300-172, it talked about the provision of specialized formats. The specialized formats are for Braille, large print, audio, and digital text. The key thing to know about those is that they provide exactly the same information as printed materials. Only the way they're presented to be perceived by the student is different. For example, if you're reading print and you need larger characters, then large print would work. But remember that print is a hard copy. In my hand I'm holding a paper with text on it. That is print, and if it were larger print, it would be large print. So that would be for visual reading, either way. There also is Braille, and that would be tactile reading. And if you are reading by hearing, then that's auditory reading. A key thing to note about these different formats is often people think they need large print when what they really want to do is in large print on a screen. So large print would not be what you want. You would want malleable text, which would be in the digital text format. And people also often make the mistake of thinking when they want auditory along with a visual support, where you can see the information and hear the information at the same time, that they may be talking about the auditory format. And yet the auditory format or the audio format does not have a visual component. So if you want both audio and a visual component at the same time, you're again talking about digital text. Now a key to think about this is to think about let's say I was your teacher and we were all in a classroom together, and some of you were using Braille, some were using large print, some audio, some digital text, and some that have the print book that we're looking at. So when we think about exactly the same information, what that means is that let's say that you all knew how to manipulate your well-designed materials well, and the technology that presents it to you. I could say, okay, everyone please go to page 72, and we're going to read paragraph 2 out loud together. And you would be able to do that because exactly the same information would be there. It would not look the same necessarily, but it would be there for you to perceive in the way that you were doing that. That's what the specialized formats are about. So when we think about AIM as specialized formats, which is important because this is part of what we're talking about here in meeting the requirements of IDEA, then it's a facilitator because it broadens our understanding beyond NIMUS as a sole means of providing accessible materials, because those specialized formats may be created from a NIMUS file, but they also could be created in many other ways: chopping and scanning, recording, making something larger on a copy machine, which is really not technically large print, but that's an aside. The barrier, though, is it applies only to print-based materials, and the use of those specialized formats as they are under the law are limited to students who meet copyright criteria. Another barrier is that it tends, for those of us who are in a decision-making place, perhaps on an IEP team, a 504 team, or some other team, it sort of equates need to specific disability categories because of the close connection to copyright, and that can be a barrier if people don't feel really comfortable with those disability categories and how that functional print disability is something a bit different than a disability category. So the common understanding is that the need for accessible materials is equated to falling into a specific disability category. Another thing that sometimes happens is the misunderstanding that acquiring for one, for instance, you have one student who meets the criteria to get materials from Bookshare, for example, or Learning Ally, that once you get that material for that one student, that you can then provide it to all students, which is not the case, and that you might look at that as fair use for educational materials, and yet when we're talking about educational materials and materials that are actually designed for use in classrooms, we can't really apply fair use very well and very logically to that giving us license to just do whatever we want with a material that was created for some. So one of the important lessons that we've learned over the years since 2004 is that accessible material is not just about NIMUS, and it's not just about accessible formats, specialized formats, excuse me. So in one of the things that's happened fairly recently, and that you see in the change of the name of the center, is that the Office of Special Education Programs has moved from accessible instructional materials to accessible educational materials. Now, functionally what we're talking about, if you see the word instructional, you can say that basically it's equal to educational and it's equal to learning. We're really talking about all the materials that come into the educational settings in which students learn and grow. So this is footnote 10 in an RFP that came out fairly recently. It's the only place that I can find where OSEP has actually defined accessible educational materials. And the key thing to look at here, because most of it is really basically the same as it was before, except for one thing. It means print and technology-based educational materials. So we're not talking anymore about just print. We're talking about all of the materials. And this is really that move into 2014, 2015, looking at not only printed but also electronic textbooks and related materials. And I would take probably a step farther than that and say we really have to think about anything that comes into the environment, whether it is a textbook or anything else, needs to be designed or enhanced in a way that makes it usable by the widest possible range of student variability, no matter what the format is, whether it's print or digital text, which are the kinds of things that the actual statutory requirements relate to, but also if something's graphical or if it's audio or if it's video, it needs to be created in such a way that it is usable and perceivable by the widest possible range of students. So with that in mind, there are sort of two ways content is developed. One is that content that's designed to be used as print. And what we know from what we've just been talking about is that that print material needs to be retrofitted, which is what the specialized formats are all about and what NIMUS is all about. But we also know that in this world there is lots of content that is designed to be used digitally. And if a material is designed to be used by all people digitally, it's difficult to retrofit if the accessibility features are not designed into that material from the start. The Online Center for Students with students with Disabilities actually says that it is difficult or impossible to actually retrofit digital materials if they do not come with a lot of accessibility options built in. Of course, what we know about accessibility options is while they may be required and needed by a small group, you're also going to have a lot of features that are usable by a much larger group and support the learning of a much larger group. So when we think about AIM, which is how we want to be thinking about it now, there are materials that are designed to be highly usable across everyone. A facilitator expands our thinking beyond printed materials to digital materials. It increases the importance of the market, meaning that it increases the importance of what publishers create and offer for sale. And it extends our thinking to non-textual material. Barriers, though, are lack of demand. Publishers will say people really aren't asking for materials with accessibility features or features that broaden usability, lots of options. So thus there's limited availability in the marketplace, and yet that's still the promising place for reaching that broader group of students. The common misunderstanding, one of the driving ones behind that, is the notion that all digital materials are accessible to everyone simply because they're digital, and we're going to talk a bit more about that as we go along. So a lesson learned is when we're thinking about AIM and digital materials, it's important to understand that the content and the delivery technology are both important to the creation of an accessible material and accessible experience for a learner. And they both require careful consideration and selection. So here are those two sides of the AIM coin. The first one is the information is the content. So what information is contained in the material that's being presented to students or to learners has to be created in such a way that it can be manipulated. And then the technology that's the delivery system that the student uses to perceive and interact with that content is how the content is actually presented to the student, what the student does to respond to and interact with that content. And of course, when we look at digital, we know that's a lot different because books really don't require that we respond to them, and yet technology does. There are things we have to be able to do. But the key piece is the information, hopefully, is more and more globally available if we have the technology that matches the student's needs and abilities, so that we're not continually creating accessible materials. I, as a person with a long background in assistive technology, when I first heard about AIM, I said, oh yeah, we create those things. We chop and scan, we record, we do all of that. The key thing about this is if that content is already accessible, we can spend a lot more time actually using that accessible content with a student to help them learn and grow. So how are decisions made about AIM? Well, it's a four-step process for decision making that has emerged over the 8 years that we've been working with state departments of education, and basically they are these. First, you look at the need for instructional materials in accessible formats. Then you select the format and features that are needed by a student for educational participation and achievement. The third step is to look at how and from what sources you can acquire the needed formats in a timely manner. And the fourth then, of course, is to determine what other supports are needed, like the technology and the training for the student, the family, the educators, perhaps some other kinds of accommodations that are needed for that student to actually be able to use those accessible materials with their technology for learning and growing. The interesting thing, if you look at these 4 steps, you'll notice that step number 3 is commence steps to acquire the needed formats. And one of the things that we see happening over and over out there is people starting at step 3. Does the student meet the qualifications or the criteria to get materials from Bookshare or from Learning Ally? Does the student meet the criteria to get materials from the NIMAC? And then sometimes if the answer is no, then the SCA or the LEA or the IEP team thinks that, well, there's just not a source, so that's done. And that really is not how it works. We really have the obligation to provide what is needed by a student so that they have access to the content. So starting at step 3 is really, that's something we'd really like to change. You'll note that there's a link here for the AIM Navigator, which is a process facilitator that can be used by decision-making teams that takes you through these 4 steps and asks some specific questions and provides some supports so that the team can think well about making these kinds of decisions. So who needs AIM? Basically, I think a key thing, and I alluded to this just a moment ago when I talked about starting at question 3, is who qualifies for AIM. And those of you who know your myths know that Pegasus the winged horse does not exist. He is not real. And neither is qualification for accessible educational materials. If you need them, then you need them and they need to be provided. Qualification does come in, but it's not until you get to the point where you're saying, and where can we get what is needed for this student? So starting out at qualification is something like Pegasus that we would really like to see just go away as a myth. So if we reframe that question and say, who needs accessible versions of educational materials for participation and achievement is really the question we want to be answering when we think about need. And one of the sort of guiding questions for that is, so can this student use the materials that are used by other students? And if the answer is no, then you'd want to be thinking about perhaps accessible versions of those materials would be useful for providing that student with the content. That's not always going to be the answer. Sometimes there'll be other things that are standing in the way, and that same density of material that's just delivered in a different way, rather than visually, auditorily, or tactily, may not be the appropriate material for that student. But lots of times it is. So when we think about who needs AIM, we think about students with disabilities who can't use those materials because perhaps blindness or visual impairment, physical impairments, a learning disability, or any other disability that impacts the ability to read, print, or use standard materials. Now keep in mind when we're talking about reading something, there's this, you have this, typically this visual contact with the material so that you can perceive that information. Well, if you have difficulty sitting upright or turning pages of a book or something like that, those are barriers to you using that printed material. And with digital materials, you often also run into those same kinds of barriers. I've laughed, and I shouldn't laugh, but many times when people say, oh, well, to read a digital book on the computer or to take the digital tests that are coming out, all you have to be able to do is drag and drop. Well, for many of the students that I've worked with, dragging and dropping is an incredibly difficult physical task. And so we can't just say, oh, well, everybody can do that, because that's not necessarily the case. One of the other things, though, that we've learned when we think about educational materials in accessible formats is that those students who meet those criteria of being students who are blind or visually impaired, have physical limitations that interfere with their ability to read, or have a learning disability or some other disability that interferes with their ability to read. We also have students who are struggling readers and others who need those kinds of materials but will not ever meet those disability requirements. So when we think about AIM, we want to look at not just students with disabilities, but also students without identified disabilities who can't make effective use of typical materials, students who lack English proficiency, or as I mentioned, struggling readers. And if you look at it from a UDL sort of perspective, students who simply prefer options for different tasks or use in different environments. For example, I'm a pretty good print reader, but if I'm driving in the car, I'm much better reading my book auditorily for that particular task in that particular environment. So all of these things, when we think about AIM, give us a much broader perspective. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't also focus on students with disabilities. When we broaden out, we're not saying that we don't attend to statutory requirements or that we don't attend to the things that are deeply, deeply meaningful and important to students with disabilities, but that we know that these same features can be useful much more broadly, which gives us a little bit different perspective about how we go about acquiring those materials. So here's some things you might want to think about in sort of a series of things. If any student is unable to read or use grade level instructional materials, obviously that would be a key, but sometimes people say, well, he can read, it just takes him a really long time, and sometimes he forgets by the end of the sentence what the beginning of the sentence was about. So that second part is, not only can he read, but read at a sufficient rate and with adequate comprehension to do what he needs to do academically successfully relative to his same age peers. And then we have the next piece, which is, or cannot do this independently or across environments or tasks. If the only way a student has access to textual materials is by someone else reading out loud to them, then we have a real issue related to independence, which then certainly becomes a real issue related to college and career readiness and to the kinds of independence that we expect of every individual as they grow into their readiness. So then the student may need AIM if any of these things are part of what you see or what you discuss. But note that may is underlined because it's also possible that that is not the answer. That is not going to be the support that, if provided, will make a difference for the student. So here's the place where a lot of people would like to start and where we can go much more deeply in the cafe as we sit around the table and chat about this. But I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro to the sources of AIM and who can use each source. There are multiple sources of AIM. You'll notice there are 5 doors, so I'm going to sort of give you 5 sources and then talk just a little bit about who can use those sources. Because a couple of the issues related to those multiple sources is all the sources don't deal with the same types of accessible materials, and some of them cannot be used to provide materials for all students. So the 5 sources are the NIMA source files that flow through the NIMAC, the National Instructional Materials Access Center. There are accessible media producers. There are locally produced materials, and there are free sources and commercial sources. So when we look at these, let's look at the NIMAC first. Students using materials that are sourced through the NIMAC have to meet copyright criteria, which means they have to be certified by a competent authority as unable to read printed materials. And of course now if we look at the broader sense of AEM, where we're talking about digital materials as well, because of blindness or other disability. Now note that the copyright criteria is blindness or other disability. It's not that specific about what those other disabilities are, even though it does give you some for instances. And students receiving materials from this source must also be served under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This means that if a student does meet copyright criteria as being a student who is unable to read printed materials because of a disability, but they are not served under IDEA, but rather under 504 or some other type of service plan, then they could not use materials that were created from this particular source. One of the things that makes it a little bit complex when we look at all of this is that idea of the qualifying disability under copyright. The National Library Service uses 4 categories: blindness, visual impairment, physical limitations, or a reading disability based on organic dysfunction. What you will find is that, what you'll find is that there are others, and the accessible media producers we're going to talk about typically do not use that reading disability based on an organic dysfunction. What we know at this particular time is that many times people look at perceptual processing kinds of issues as part of a physical limitation. Excuse me. So I can let you chew on that one for just a moment. The only reason this makes a difference is because the competent authority is a bit different for a reading disability based on organic dysfunction. For the others, there's a much more flexible group of people who can be the competent authority that says that this disability is created. For a reading disability based on organic dysfunction, the competent authority must be a doctor of medicine. And so this is a kicker for lots and lots of places. What we've talked about at the AIM Center is to look at your students' needs, look at what they need, and look at all of the places who have what they need, what you need to provide to your students. Then look at the criteria that each of those sources has set up. And if your student meets the criteria for that source, go forward. So since everybody doesn't use quite the same interpretation, find the ones that work for you. So the other sources, we talked about the NIMUS and the NIMAC, only print disabilities, and the use is constrained by copyright and IDEA. Accessible media producers, again, talk about printed materials, but their use is constrained by copyright restrictions. Now, the ones you know the best are Bookshare, Learning Ally, the American Printing House for the Blind. There's also Digital Talking Books and the National Library Service and many, many other accessible media producers. You do not have to be served under IDEA to use materials from an accessible media producer, but you must meet copyright restrictions as defined by those sources. The locally produced, which is certainly the way we used to do lots and lots of things, and we probably will always be doing some things locally produced. For example, you will never find a teacher-made test in some other place to get it, so that would have to be locally made accessible. But one of the key things to think about is there are still some copyright restraints. You can't take something that is copyrighted by someone else and make an accessible version of that and then provide it broad scale to everybody else. But even at best, if we put all of that aside, what we know is locally produced requires significant human resources. It takes a lot of time and effort to actually create a usable, clean, locally produced digital file. And I think there are probably many people probably on this call who have been in that situation and know exactly what that's about. So we'd like to move that human resource to actually using those materials rather than having to create them. Certainly there are free sources. You can find them all over the web, and there are no limitations, but they may not be the same as used by others. So you really have to think about, could that free source be used by everybody, or is there a limit there that's getting in the way? One thing about the free sources too, if you're looking for a particular book that's perhaps out of copyright, look at several sources because they're not always created at the same level of fineness. They're not always created some are not as created as well or as cleanly as others. So look around a little bit and see what's out there. If it's free, just look and take what you need. Commercial sources are probably the hope, well, they are certainly the hope of the future. The idea that we would be able to purchase materials that have deep levels of options available that make them more widely usable and accessible. And of course the key there is you don't have to worry about what sort of copyright, how they're served, all of those things. You purchase for anyone you use with anyone. You don't purchase for one and use with 50 though, but we know that in schools. So our lesson learned there is that as the publishing industry goes digital, the most promising sources of AIM for everybody are accessible digital learning materials that are developed by publishers and made available for purchase, and then open educational resources which could also be created in accessible formats. One of the things, though, that we think about is that in a world going digital, then accessibility seems like it would be less of a problem, does it not? Well, unfortunately, it is still a big problem because many of the digital educational materials and the delivery systems that are used for them are not very accessible. Keeping in mind, too, that accessibility is a bit of a moving target because what lowers a barrier for someone who's blind may raise a barrier for someone who's deaf or someone who has learning disability. In fact, I heard a story today where early on in the work that led to the creation of the NIMAS file, somebody said there was quite a group of people with a variety of disabilities in the group because, you know, sort of the nothing about us without us kind of thing. This was not something that people who were not disabled were making decisions about people who were disabled without them being a very important part of the conversation. So the people who were blind or visually impaired said, no problem, just give us everything in text. And the people with learning disabilities said, whoa, text is the problem. So there you can see a little bit of that that need for rich options that can be turned off and on depending on what somebody needs. So here's that Center for Online Learning and Students with Disabilities quote that I mentioned earlier. Virtually no elementary or secondary system has the capacity to retrofit that digital content for accessibility. One of the things that the AIM Center has been working on for quite some time is an initiative called the PALM initiative, Purchase Accessible Learning Materials. Here's a place where you see not instructional, not educational, but learning, and remember that those are all the same things we're talking about here. And when we think about, is it there? Yes. That purchasing materials that have those options in them are going to make them more widely usable, and that's going to be beneficial not only to people who require those rich options, but to many who simply can use and benefit from those. And there's a question I see about how about open source materials? Open source materials are terrific because they're free, but they also may be just like publisher-created digital materials. They may not be created with accessibility options built in. They may, but we can't assume that they are. So again, many of the same kinds of things that are talked about in the PALM initiative with purchasing them can also be applied to what we're looking for when we're seeking to identify open source materials that can be used. So when we think about, I'm sorry, I really wanted you to know that, I guess, because I put it in twice. So when we think about the benefits of purchasing accessible materials or acquiring through open source accessible materials, one of the things, some of those benefits include that it supports inclusion. You don't have to really be looking at lots of different materials, but that students can use the same materials in the variety of formats. And it benefits all students learning because some of those requirements for some students are supportive features and scaffolds that can be used for learning by lots of students, many students, if not all students. It's certainly easier for us who are teachers and family members to plan and teach because we don't have to know lots of different sources of content, but rather ways that people have access to that content. And it eliminates those eligibility questions that I have to tell you that after 8 years of deeply being immersed in this work, that people go immediately to that place to see, to get deeply confused and involved. And I've been involved in a couple of conversations just in the last couple of days that have been amazing to me because of the way several different things have been fit together that really don't go together. So that complexity continues even though there's been lots and lots and lots of work to try to make it less complex. And then the other benefit of purchasing accessible materials is that the costly accommodations of buying different sets of materials to provide accommodations for the materials that were initially required that are now not accessible. If we think proactively about what are we looking for, not only in digital content, but also in the technology by which digital content is delivered to students, we can make some much better decisions. So where can you get help when you need it? Well, at the National Center for Accessible Educational Materials for Learning is certainly one of those places. And this is a screenshot from the homepage of the AIM Center, aem.cast.org. And there are lots of different things that you can find in this particular place. And I would urge you to go have a look at the AIM Center and poke around, and also let us know if what you need that you're not finding there, because that's one of the things that we're working on as we gear up the universal technical assistance that's available to everyone through the website. So as we come to this particular place in this, I'm sure what has felt to you like a flood of information that fits together in some ways and grates upon itself in other ways. Kofi Annan says that knowledge is power and that information is liberating. Education is the premise of progress in every society and every family. And when we think about this, we want to make sure that the ways that we impart knowledge, the way that we use knowledge, the way students that respond to information is critically important to not only their success in school, but their success post-school, in the workplace, in college and career, and think about ways that we can make this happen for every student. So some of the things you can do is have a look at the AIM Center website, and please believe me, there are many, many other places that you can also find information. You can find information at the Center for Technology and Disability. We work together, obviously, as you heard at the beginning. I'm part of the faculty for that center. One of my colleagues is on the board of that center. We have, at the AIM Center, we have a relationship with FHI 360 and with the center. And so we all work together to make sure that to the greatest extent possible, we move the field forward for the benefit of students and families. So use the information and the tools that you find on the AIM Center and other sites to help identify needs and explore the options to meet those needs. Particularly, I'd recommend that you have a look at the AIM Navigator. And then go to AIM State Contacts. You'll find that under the legal part. Let me go back a couple of slides here. There's Policies and Systems, which I'm pointing with my finger, which you can't see, but Policies and Systems is the third major heading in the black line. And if you pull that down, you'll see a place where it says State, and if you select State, you'll see in the the left-hand column a place that says primary contacts or state contacts. You can go to that place for your state and you can find out who at your State Department of Education is the person that can tell you what exactly is happening in your state related to accessible educational materials. And then remember that we certainly don't forget statutory obligations. But we don't limit ourselves to statutory obligations. We go beyond those statutory obligations to excellent instructional practices. And we also do everything we can to push for AIM in the marketplace and make sure that people who are selecting educational materials and are a part of acquiring educational materials know the importance of that broad usability and accessibility, and that those features need to be there in whatever is acquired and brought into the the learning environments. And so before we go to see you in the cafe, I'm going to see, are there any questions? I only see one, but I might have missed those. So Russ and Anna Maria and anyone else? Is there anything that you would like to bring up? Perhaps you have a question even.
Well, first of all, thanks very much, Joy. One question that had come up that Anna Maria answered the question about whether it was recorded and whether it could be seen again. And it will be. It'll be available tomorrow. If you missed any part of it, want to check it out again. And you can go to the CTD event website, and you'll be able to see a link there for that. The other thing that will be there will be the cafe discussion, and it'll be clearly marked. You'll be able to join a discussion with Joy and the other folks that are in attendance here. And what we're going to be doing is sending some questions to kind of hopefully stimulate that conversation, and we really hope you'll take the time during the week to check back in the discussion area and participate and have a say, ask your questions, share your opinions and all. Joy is very open to all opinions and interested in dialoguing with folks in every area of providing these materials, and it looked like we had a really good cross-section when we got started there. And then the last piece just to mention before we go, we'll have a wrap-up webinar from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock this Friday with Joy again. And your participation in the discussion area will help to frame that webinar and what we cover and what we choose to get into. And we are putting the links up there. And I think, Joy, you had one more poll?
I did. I had another polling question, but I also wanted to give everybody a couple of minutes to, if you thought of a question or a comment that you might want to put in. If your head is spinning just a little bit and you were one of the people who didn't know anything or were very new to AIM conversations, I would say that you're probably in a really good place, that's about where people are as they begin to delve into accessible educational materials, because there's just a lot that all either fits together or maybe doesn't quite fit together, and how we engage in discussions of those issues so that we can really look at what can we do for everyone, and then what can we do specifically for this individual child as we need to do. So there is one more polling question that will help us move into the cafe. So if you could bring that up, Anna Maria. It's basically, as we move into the cafe and continue our conversations, from your perspective, what are you most interested in digging much more deeply into in that cafe discussion?
And then people, it's weird. Starting to come a little bit back up because they're saying to me, they're like, wow, it's April, and you haven't, like, given up. I'm like, no, that's not how I function.
And note that there is a place there for other questions and comments that you're going to just bring to the cafe, because that's absolutely fine too. And it's exciting to see that there are people who are interested in virtually all parts. People, I think, feel pretty comfortable with the identification of students who may need AIM. I think what happens when we look out there into the field at large is that a lot of people are sort of bypassing that step just a little bit. So we'll be talking some about that, but we will also be talking about all of these things, and I hope that I'll see you in the cafe and that you will be very specific about what you want to talk about, because that's really the time. Also know that in addition to discussion in the cafe, that the Friday webinar will be a very different experience in that it's meant to be very interactive and very focused, and really a continuation and sort of summary of the conversation. So it has been absolutely my pleasure to be here for this kickoff, and I hope to see you in the cafe. And the great thing is, in this cafe, we can drink coffee as we're writing, or we can have a sip of vino if we prefer, because we are all in our own places. So it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thanks again, Joy. And I want to mention that Anna Marie has put up a survey. We're always looking for feedback on the webinars. We're always looking to do the best job we possibly can, so appreciate it if you would take the time to click on that link and respond to that survey as well. Joy, thanks for a really great start.
My pleasure. Looking forward to talking with you more.
I will say, I'm sorry we're not doing this anymore, and that's for